Before I got married, I thought I was joining a family, not walking into a social class war. Paul and I met at work. We were in different departments, bonded over terrible breakroom coffee, and slowly fell in love over spreadsheets and sarcastic emails. He was kind, reliable, and surprisingly great at cooking. We moved in together after a year and split everything down the middle: bills, chores, grocery runs. At first, I thought it was a perfect balance. What I didn't expect was that his family would treat me like a parasite. It didn't start immediately. We lived far enough from them that visits were rare. Paul had warned me that his parents, especially his mother, were a little intense. I didn't press for details. I figured it couldn't be worse than the occasional meddling or passive-aggressive remark. I was wrong. The first real glimpse came about a year into our marriage. Out of nowhere, Everly, his mother, called Paul and announced she and Tiffany, his sister, were stopping by. They didn't ask. They just showed up. It was a Wednesday afternoon. I had just gotten home from work, changed into sweatpants, and was halfway through prepping dinner when the buzzer rang. Paul was still at the office. I opened the door and found them both standing there with shopping bags and judgmental smiles. Everly walked in without waiting for an invitation. "Still in this place?" she said, glancing around the apartment. "I thought you two would have upgraded by now." Tiffany wrinkled her nose. "Smells like beans and rice. Are you guys meal prepping again?" "We usually cook on Sundays for the week," I said, trying to keep my voice even. Everly strolled into the kitchen, opened the fridge, and made a theatrical sound of disappointment. "Not even a bottle of wine? No cheese platter?" "Jasmine, darling." Paul didn't grow up on microwave lasagna. I stood there, frozen. She wasn't even trying to be subtle. They made themselves comfortable on our couch, flipping through a design catalog they'd brought, just in case we wanted to redecorate. Tiffany snapped a photo of our throw pillows, whispered something to her mother, and laughed. By the time Paul got home, I was red-faced and silent. He stopped in the doorway, confused. "What's going on?" "We just wanted to check in," Everly purred, "and maybe inspire Jasmine to lift her standards a little." Paul looked at me. I gave him nothing. I didn't want to be the one who caused the fight. He looked back at them. "Don't come over uninvited again." Everly smiled like it was a joke. "We're family. We don't need an invitation," but it didn't stop there. The next week, it happened again. Then again. Always between 5 and 8 p.m., when Paul was still at work and I was alone. They'd show up, let themselves in, and treat the apartment like a second-rate Airbnb. Everly would comment on the curtains. Tiffany would critique my dinner prep. They once brought over a bag of leftover designer clothes and casually suggested I elevate my image. I tried not to react. I tried to be civil. I told Paul everything afterward, and he scolded them each time. But they didn't care. They even started waiting for me outside the building. 3 separate times I saw Everly's luxury SUV parked near the front entrance. Once, as I approached, Tiffany rolled down the window and said, "You're like a shadow clinging to Paul's leg." It's actually sad I walked past them without a word. After that, I started waiting in cafes until Paul finished work. I'd sit for hours with cold tea just to avoid being home alone with them. The worst part? They always left before Paul arrived. He never saw the full picture. The bitterness, the subtle jabs, the smug looks. Then came the worst of it. They let themselves in again. I was still in my work clothes, bent over the stove. Everly sat on the bar stool and smiled like a cat with a mouse. "I hope you're planning to give Paul a child soon." "You don't want to waste your only value," Tiffany followed with, "Yeah, if you're not planning to be a real wife, you could at least be quiet. Some people marry up, but you're just borrowed furniture." I didn't respond. I couldn't. But then Tiffany's tone shifted. "And if you even think about touching Paul's savings," she said, leaning forward, "we'll erase you. Socially, legally, financially, we're not joking." They left 5 minutes later. I didn't remember turning off the stove. I just stood there staring at the wall. Paul came home at 9. I didn't tell him everything that night. I didn't have the energy. But the next day I did. He was livid. He called his mother, then his father. Nigel listened quietly, then said, "Well, Jasmine's not what we envisioned for Paul. She's a rarity. A poor wife in our family." That's all he had to say. I sat in the living room after Paul hung up, staring out the window at the evening sky. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just sat. My phone buzzed. Simon. Heard they're treating you like dirt. You okay? Me. They think we're nothing. Simon. Then maybe it's time we remind them who we are. I stared at the message. Then I stood, walked over to my laptop, and opened a new document. At the top of the page, I typed, "Family visit, next weekend." Then I leaned back in my chair, the keys still warm under my fingers, and exhaled. Paul was hesitant. "You really want to go through with this?" he asked as I closed my laptop the following week. I didn't look up. They wanted to make it about status. Let's give them what they want. We didn't tell them we were coming. That was intentional. Everly and Tiffany never gave me that courtesy. Simon called early Saturday. "We're ready." The car's outside. I looked through the window and froze. It was a Bentley, not rented. Simon's father-in-law had loaned it to him for the day, some sort of goodwill repayment. Polished black with silver trim, it looked like a spaceship had landed on our street. I stepped into it wearing a minimalist cream dress and nude heels. My mother wore her hair up and had borrowed a clutch from Simon's wife, who always looked like she walked off a runway. My father had dug out the most expensive suit he owned, a custom navy pinstripe with a barely noticeable monogram. It still had that sharp-shouldered authority that made people sit straighter in boardrooms. We didn't dress to impress. We dressed for armor. The closer we got to Everly and Nigel's house, the more silent the car became. When we finally turned the corner onto their quiet cul-de-sac, I saw Everly and Tiffany standing on the porch, wine glasses in hand, basking in the spring sun. The moment they spotted the Bentley, they froze. Everly blinked like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Tiffany leaned forward, hand raised to block the glare, lips slightly parted. As we pulled into the driveway, Paul stepped out first. Everly rushed down the porch steps. "Paul? What is this? You bought this car?" Tiffany was already circling it, her heels tapping the pavement like a high-fashion judge at a car show. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Is this the new Continental GT?" "Paul, this is insane." Paul smiled calmly. "It's not mine." Everly tilted her head. "What?" "It's Jasmine's father's car," he said, almost too casually. Silence. Everly's expression collapsed like a bad meringue. Then the doors opened. My father stepped out of the back in his tailored suit, buttoning the front of his jacket with quiet precision. My mother followed behind, graceful and elegant in muted navy, and then Simon stepped out from the passenger side. 6 feet tall, shoulders back, expression unreadable. His suit matched my father's. Tiffany visibly gasped. Simon offered Everly a cool smile. "Good to see you again." Everly stood frozen. Tiffany blinked rapidly like someone had just knocked the air from her lungs. Paul looked between them. "Well, aren't you going to say hello?" Everly suddenly snapped out of it. "Yes, of course. Come in, come in. Let me show you the living room. I'll make some tea." The woman who used to criticize my curtains was now fluffing couch pillows like a nervous Airbnb host. Tiffany rushed to the kitchen, mumbling something about getting the good china. They ushered us in like royalty. No mention of microwave lasagna this time. Everly disappeared briefly and returned with lemon scones and loose-leaf tea. She poured like her hands were made of glass. "So," she said with a tight smile, "what brings you all by today?" My father was calm, seated straight with one ankle over his knee. "Jasmine thought it was time we reconnected. We haven't had much of a proper introduction since the wedding." Tiffany couldn't take her eyes off Simon. "So, you work with your dad?" Simon nodded. "I'm our international accounts lead. I handle negotiations with European and East Asian clients. I spend about half the year overseas." "Wow," she said, brushing her hair behind one ear. "That's really cool. Are you single?" My father raised an eyebrow. Simon smiled politely. "Married." Tiffany's smile faltered, but only for a moment. "Well, you know, some people are with the wrong person." Simon blinked. "Sorry." Tiffany shrugged. "I'm just saying, some couples aren't matched well. Looks, ambition, taste, compatibility. It's unfortunate, but it happens." My hands clenched in my lap. She wasn't even being subtle. My mom, sitting beside me, gently touched my arm but said nothing. Simon tilted his head. "Are you talking about my wife?" Tiffany's tone became syrupy. "I just think you could do better." No offense, Simon looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, but not the nice kind. You think I could do better than a multilingual Rhodes Scholar who was handpicked by Oxford Pharmaceuticals for their biotech division? Tiffany blinked. Simon continued, tone even. Her father runs a fund that manages over $600 million in assets. She's sharp, kind, and way out of my league. But somehow, she chose me. He let that sink in. I don't mean to be unkind, Tiffany, he added, but if you think you're the better match, you might want to recalibrate your metrics. Tiffany turned a shade paler. Everly dropped her spoon. Silence stretched like plastic wrap across the room. Paul leaned back and sighed quietly. Then Everly tried to recover. Well, she said, voice trembling, we didn't mean to misjudge anything. My father finally spoke again. We don't flaunt wealth. That's not how we were raised. But respect isn't about net worth. It's about how you treat people when you think they have nothing. Neither Everly nor Tiffany responded. Nigel hadn't said a word since we arrived. He simply stared at the carpet like it might swallow him. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Their faces said enough. We finished our tea in silence. Just before we left, Tiffany looked up and, against all logic, tried one last time. Simon, she said, smoothing her blouse. Maybe we could grab coffee sometime? Simon didn't blink. My wife would laugh herself unconscious. Tiffany looked like the air had been knocked out of her. Her mouth was still open, as if she meant to speak but forgot how. Everly sat frozen beside her, her posture rigid, the cheerful hostess mask slipping by the second. Her hand hovered over her teacup, but she didn't pick it up. Nigel hadn't said a single word since we arrived. He hadn't moved much either. He sat at the far end of the couch, eyes glued to the floor as if the carpet held the secret to disappearing from the room. Simon, meanwhile, stood by the window now, glancing through the sheer curtain at the parked Bentley. He looked utterly calm, like a man who had just shut down a ridiculous business proposal with facts and grace. And he had. The silence in the living room stretched, heavy and awkward. My mother shifted slightly, smoothing her skirt, keeping her chin lifted but her gaze neutral. My father, however, sat back with the calm of someone who'd been waiting for this moment for a long time. Everly finally spoke, her voice faint. We didn't know Jasmine's family was... She trailed off, realizing the sentence had no good ending. Simon turned back towards her and raised an eyebrow. Wealthy? Educated? Successful? Human? Tiffany cleared her throat. That's not what she looked like when we first met her. You mean she didn't wear a brand name you recognized? My mother said gently. That's not the same thing as not having value. My father leaned forward then, resting his arms on his knees. We've never flaunted what we have. Not because we're ashamed of it, but because it's not what defines us. Everly blinked. We assumed. You assumed wrong, my father said calmly, and you treated our daughter accordingly. Tiffany visibly recoiled. Paul sat in the corner of the room, hands clasped, watching quietly. He hadn't said much since the confrontation. I knew he was letting it play out, letting me and my family take the space we hadn't been given before. My father continued. You mocked her, humiliated her, came into her home and made her feel like a stranger in it. And you did it because you believed she was beneath you. Everly's voice cracked. We were trying to guide her, to help her fit in. She never needed to fit into anything, my mother said sharply. She's not clay for you to mold. She's not a project. She's your son's wife. Tiffany sank back into the couch, her voice now barely a whisper. I didn't mean for it to be that serious. Simon let out a short laugh. You threatened to erase her socially and financially. That sounded pretty serious. Everly opened her mouth again, but then Nigel finally spoke. I told Paul, he said slowly, his voice gravelly, that she was unusual for our family. I said she was rare. He looked up at me. But I wasn't talking about her being poor. I stared at him, unsure what to make of this statement. He added, I meant she was the first one in a long time who didn't look at us like we were special. And I guess that made us nervous. It was the closest thing to honesty I'd heard from any of them. My father stood. We didn't come here for apologies, he said plainly. We came here to close the loop. Jasmine deserved to be seen for who she is, not who you decided she must be. Everly stood too, but her hands were shaking. I see her now, she said. I swear, I see it now. My mom and I rose together. Simon was already at the door, holding it open. My father gave a nod to Everly, but said nothing more. We exited in silence, the kind that fills a room after a storm has passed. Outside, Simon held the car door for my mother. My father waited until she was seated before getting in himself. I was the last to step into the Bentley. As I did, I glanced back at the house. Paul stood in the doorway, watching us. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were focused on me. He stepped down slowly and walked to the car just as Simon started the engine. "I'll ride back separately," he said, "but I'll see you at home." I nodded. He leaned down slightly. "Are you okay?" "I will be." He paused, then added quietly, "Thank you for not blowing up." Even when you had every reason I didn't reply, that evening, Paul and I sat in our living room. No TV, just quiet. "I should have stepped in sooner," he said finally. "You tried," I replied, "but I needed to take space. And I needed them to see it for themselves." He nodded. A few days passed without incident. Then, out of nowhere, I got an email from Everly. Subject: "Thank you. I was wrong about everything. You didn't deserve any of it. I'm sorry. Everly." I didn't respond. Later that week, Tiffany sent a text. "Tiffany, do you think we could start over? Maybe coffee?" I showed Paul. He shook his head. "That's your call." But I didn't. From that day forward, Everly and Tiffany never showed up unannounced again. There were no more comments about how I dressed, what I cooked, or where I came from. If they spoke to me at all, it was through cautiously worded emails or awkward holiday cards. Paul still visited them on occasion, out of familial duty more than affection. He said things had changed, that they were humbler, quieter, even, God forbid, curious about how I was doing. "They ask about you now," he told me one night. Not to check up. Just to know I wasn't sure whether I believed it, but I was okay not knowing. I had peace. That was enough. It's strange how people only learn to respect boundaries once they've been forced to confront them. All they saw was a girl in basic shoes, living in a modest apartment with a man they thought deserved more. They didn't bother to look deeper. They assumed wealth meant wisdom. That silence meant weakness. But in the end, it wasn't the Bentley that changed everything. It was the silence afterward. The silence of embarrassment. The silence of realization. The silence of people who finally saw how loud their own arrogance had been. I didn't need revenge. I just needed them to hear the sound of their own pride breaking.